Welcome to Discovery Adventures. Just going to give it a few seconds for you all to be able to join. Today we are coming to you through a Zoom webinar, so some of you can join us in chatting. You'll see a chat button at the bottom and you can ask us questions. There's the Q&A button down there, so feel free to ask us questions. And we might ask you questions and you can answer them in the chat. Some of you might be joining us through YouTube live streaming, and go ahead and join along. If we ask a question, you can shout it out to the air or a person next to you, whatever you think the answer might be. We're so glad that you are here with us today. I am joined by Anna, who is in the Field Museum, and we are going to be talking today about pangolins. We also have Jeff with us. Some of you may have seen him in some past episodes. He's going to be behind the scenes, but he might be answering some questions in the chat. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to pass it along to Anna at the Field Museum. Hi, Anna.
Hello, Marcy, and hello, everybody that's watching, whether you're at home or school or wherever you may be. We are so excited to have you in the Field Museum with us today, virtually. So as you can see, I am here around some of our amazing animals. Today is going to be all about pangolins, which are such cool animals. I hope that you either already like pangolins or maybe that you don't even know what a pangolin is yet. Because on this journey, we are going to explore pangolins in a pretty exciting extent, but we'll never cover it all. But please ask us any questions that you can think of, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We're going to be covering what is a pangolin. So we're going to learn the generalities of what this animal is. We're going to learn about how they survive, some of the different adaptations and features they have to navigate their environment. And we're also going to learn about why they're important to talk about right now. We're going to learn about the threats that they face in the wild and some ways that we can take actions to help. So first of all, we're going to try to figure out what is a pangolin. So behind me, this is a taxidermy or preserved mount of a pangolin on the outside, and above that is another pangolin, and it's just a skeleton. There's 8 different types of pangolins, but we're going to try to figure out where they fit into the animal world. So we're going to get started off with a quick trivia question of what animal group is the most closely related to pangolin. So if you're on our Zoom, you'll have an interactive poll popping up in a second. There it goes. And Marcy will share a screen so you can see that question if you're on YouTube. So I want to know what you think. Do you think a pangolin is most closely related to armadillos, anteaters, bears, or sloths? And actually, all of these are animals that are pretty close to me. So if you're like, what even is an armadillo? Armadillos are right over there, those little armored animals. An anteater is also very close to me, right over here. As is, the bear's a little further away, but there are bears. I don't know if you, they may be too far away, but they're across the hall. I promise they're out there. And then the sloths right behind me on this side. And how close they are to me and to these pangolins might be deceiving. So the museum's been up for a long time. Maybe we've learned some new things about where they fit into the animal family tree. So
we have some guesses in the chat of ground sloth. Maybe they're related to a ground sloth or an armadillo because they have those scales.
That's a really good observation. They have those exterior coverings or scales. It does kind of look like an armadillo. And it looks like armadillos are the overwhelming majority of people's votes. So most people voted for armadillos, followed by anteaters, followed by sloths. And in very last place with 1 vote is the bear. Well, let's take a quick look at my favorite phylogenetic tree, which is a chart that shows us how animals are related. And we're going to take a quick check-in with this diagram. Okay, I know it's a little hard to see the words, but that's what I'm here for. Okay, so this is like a branched tree of life. And at all those points where it branches out, there's a common ancestor. Now, because of those scales on the outside, a lot of people thought pangolins were related to armadillos. Armadillos are right here. They're actually pretty closely related to sloths. They're right next to them. But the pangolins, now that we can look at their DNA and see exactly where they fit in as far as ancestry and similarities, are way over here. And the pangolins are actually really close to carnivores, which includes dogs and cats and bears. So those are their next door neighbors. So surprisingly, it is way over here. Where do the anteaters go to? Oh, sloths and anteaters are both here. So sloths and anteaters are like the closest relatives, which are really close to armadillos. Then pangolins are way over there. So it's kind of surprising. So congratulations to the one person that thought it was a bear. But to everyone else, it makes a lot of sense to group it with any of those other animals. And that's what most scientists thought for a really long time. But we'll take a quick look at some of those features. Now there's 8 different types of pangolins. They all have scales on the outside. And we can see really closely that there's even some little white lines in between those scales. And I believe we had, Mercy, what was that question from Talcott about telling them apart, right?
Yeah, Talcott School brought us some questions beforehand, and one of them is, what are the differences between species?
Yeah, so one of those differences is whether or not they have tiny hairs in between the scales. They are mammals, so they do have hairs. They're just not covered in hair like some fuzzy mammals like cats and dogs. But we'll see them in between the scales on 4 of the 8 species. So there's 4 that live in Africa and 4 that live in Asia. And on all the Asian species, you're going to see those little hairs in between the scales. So that's one way that you can tell apart different species. Another way you can tell them apart is looking at some other features. So of those 8 species, some live on the ground and some live in trees. You can see behind me, the skeleton has a really, really long tail. It's much longer than the tail of this one that's closer to me relative to its body size. And so with those tiny, skinny, long tails, they're actually living in trees, and their tail is prehensile, which means it can grab onto branches and help them explore. So you're going to look for some that are on the ground and some that are in trees. Those are some other differences between the different species. And then, of course, where they live, both on like continents, countries, because we've got the 4 in Africa, 4 in Asia, and also living in the ground or the trees. They have different body types for those 2 different environments. That's a very good question. And then we'll also take a quick look at some of these adaptations that we already saw a little bit of. So when we have adaptations, they help us survive. They're kind of like animal superpowers. And one of my favorite superpowers on the pangolin is these claws. They've got pretty long claws. If you're here on Zoom and can type into the chat, does anybody have ideas of what they might use those claws for? And you can see the one behind me too also has some pretty long claws. Big guy. And it looks like we're seeing some digging to climb trees. Lots of votes for digging and climbing. Yeah, digging is exactly a really good use of these claws. And they're digging for their favorite snacks, or sometimes burrows. The ones that live on the ground will burrow into the earth and live there, make dens there to have a family, but they also like to look for their snacks. So they're going to be digging into the ground for their very favorite food. So we know that their food lives in the ground. That's what they're digging for. And we can also try to take a look at their teeth. The skeleton up there is really small, so it's kind of hard to see the teeth. But their teeth are very similar to the teeth of an anteater. And there's just an anteater skull over here. So we'll look at it. It's a very long head here, and this post is unfortunately in the middle. But does anybody notice anything about the teeth in an anteater? Can you see any teeth? And are there any things, so I see some people say, no, I can't see any teeth either. There are no teeth. So the anteater and the pangolin both have no teeth. So to all the people that thought pangolins might be anteaters, this is yet another similarity that makes that a very reasonable conclusion. It's easy to think that they're related to them because they've got a lot in common. So they have no teeth, they're eating something that they're digging for, it's in the ground, and they don't need teeth to eat it. Anybody have any guesses as to what foods might live in the ground that they're digging for? But you don't really need any teeth to get them. So I'm seeing some ants, worms, ants, bugs, lots of bugs. That is exactly right, my friends. So the pangolin specializes in eating ants and termites. Some really fun little bugs that you maybe don't want a lot of around, and they're really good at it. They can eat thousands of bugs every single day. So very good to have a pangolin around if you don't want to be overrun by ants and termites. Pretty cool. And then their other feature that we've seen all over their bodies and talked about a little bit before is those scales. So we know how they're getting their food, how they're eating it. They also have a super long tongue. Their tongue goes all the way down into their pelvis where their hips are. Their tongue is super long. So they can dig a hole, stick their tongue out, get those delicious ants. But they've also got these scales. Those scales on the outside, if you're wondering what they feel like, you can feel your fingernails. They're made out of the same material, which is also the same as your hair. And that's called keratin. So why do you think they're covered in these scales? How might that be useful for them? What do you think, little pangolin? What are you going to do with all those scales?
Doesn't look like, oh, here we go. We got some answers coming in. For protection,
Yeah,
like a turtle.
That's exactly right. So the name pangolin comes from a word in Malay, which means roller. And they roll into a ball exactly for that reason you said, for protection. So they will protect themselves and their soft, squishy bellies, where they do not have scales, by rolling into a tight little ball. And actually, Marcy, do you have that picture of a pangolin rolled into a ball? So all of my pangolins are not rolled up, but there's a picture of one that's rolled up. And what's really cool is when they're rolled up, they're so strong, predators aren't able to get them at all. So lions have actually been observed playing with these and kind of batting them around. If you have any cats at home, maybe you've seen them play with a ball, or if it's like my cat, a piece of trash, and just smacking things around and playing with it because they can't figure out how to eat it because it's too protected with all of those awesome, super strong scales. Those are some of their major adaptations that keep the pangolin safe and help them get their food and survive in the environment. But we're going to talk next about why we're even talking about pangolins. And that's because they're really important and they're really threatened, and therefore it's important that we learn about them. So pangolins are one of the most trafficked animals in the world. I believe they are considered to be the most trafficked animal in the world, but a lot of that is happening secretly, so it's hard to have all the data. What that means when we say trafficked, it means that people are moving them around. They are buying and selling and taking them out of the wild because there's a lot of demand. So the biggest threat for the pangolin, first of all, is just human demand. People are very interested in these animals. The reasons they want these animals is because of those awesome protective scales. Now, it's really awesome for the pangolin. It's not as awesome for people, but people are still really interested in these scales. This is a scale from the giant ground pangolin. You can see the scale is pretty big compared to the other pangolins we've been looking at. It's from an even bigger species. And it's just keratin. It's just like our fingernails. It doesn't have any significant properties, but people have associated it with medicines for a really long time. So they are continuing to try to make medicines out of pangolin scales that don't have any big effect, but the interest is still there. So thousands, like tens of thousands of pounds of pangolin scales are confiscated every year. And Marcy has a picture of this too. So there's some really big piles that you're about to see of pangolin scales that have been found and confiscated from people that were moving them and selling them. And they're all going to be set on fire. If you've ever seen ivory or rhino horns or other animal products that have to be destroyed, because if they exist, it's going to keep perpetuating this demand and interest in people buying and selling them. So they're just going to destroy them. But that's all pangolin scales. So as you can imagine, that is a lot of pangolins that had to die to be turned into these big piles of scales that people wanted to buy. So it's a very, very big problem. So we need to figure out how to decrease the human demand. And actually, because of COVID-19, there are some new laws that have made it harder to sell pangolins. They've increased the punishments if you're found with pangolins. So there's some good stuff that has come out of that. And we can talk more about COVID-19 later, because that's also pangolin connection point. Another big issue with pangolins is habitat loss. So this is an issue all around the world all the time. If the places where they live are being developed, if there's new roads that are cutting through their territory, if there's pollution in the environment, they're not going to be able to survive. So habitat loss is another big problem. And some of that can happen from climate change too. If there's climate change that's affecting the weather and it's a drought in an area, there's not enough rain for the grass, there's not enough grass for the ants, there's not enough food for the pangolin. So human demand is literally taking the pangolins out of the environment. Habitat loss. They don't have enough places to live or to eat. And then another big issue is just lack of information. If you have never heard about a pangolin until today, you are not alone. These are animals that we're still learning a lot about. They haven't been studied a lot before. And so there's a risk of losing these animals before we know a lot. Of all the 8 pangolin species, they're all endangered with extinction. Some of them are listed as vulnerable. Some of them are listed as critically endangered. But a lot of them we still are missing information on. So we're hoping to learn a lot more. And so the last thing I want to talk about too, before we get into all of your exciting questions, and definitely keep asking us questions, is the 3 things that we can think about with those pangolin threats and then what you can do. So the first one is human demand. If you do not live in Asia, it is unlikely you're going to be in an environment where people are going to be selling pangolins. But you as a human are probably in situations where you might be using animals for something. Does anybody have pets? I know I have a few pets. And some people might also eat animals. And I mean, I eat animals, not all the time, but sometimes. I ate some eggs when I was baking yesterday too. And you may also visit animals. If anybody's ever been to a zoo or any type of wildlife park where you saw animals, these are ways that we interact with animals, that there's like a demand for animals in our lives. And if we're really mindful about how is that going to affect those animals, can we make sure that we're getting our food from animals, from places where those animals have really high welfare, where they're going to be treated really well? If you're getting a pet, are you making sure, especially if it's an exotic pet, with cats or dogs, it is much less likely that it's going to be taken from the wild at any point. But if you're getting a type of lizard or a frog or a bird, it's really good to make sure we know where those are coming from. Some people can even find pet sloths, which is not a great idea. Personal angle there, but a lot of animals are not great for pets and might be impacting wild populations. So definitely make sure you research where your pets are coming from and make sure that it's a responsible situation that's not impacting wild animals. Another one is zoos. I love zoos. And if anybody has watched Tiger King this era, you may have seen some zoo-like things that don't have great animal welfare and aren't necessarily helping wild animals. But zoos that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, like Brookfield or Lincoln Park Zoo, they do a lot of important research there. They're giving a lot of support and financial fuel to do research in the wild with different projects. And they have really high standards of animal welfare. So making sure all the different ways we might be having demand for animals is really supporting animals, because I think we all love animals. I know I do. And I've seen in the chat a lot of people that have some cool pets. That is awesome. I think it's really good to have animals in our lives. I think people and animals are always going to have an interconnected life. It's just good to make sure we're doing it in sustainable and meaningful ways. Another thing is habitat loss, right? Does anybody have a garden? I actually don't have a garden. I live in a tiny apartment that's up in the sky. I probably could try to have a window box or something, but I don't really have a garden. But if you might have a garden and you might have a yard, you might have spaces that you could make animal habitat or improve it. And some people are also noting the snow. The snow is so much right now in Chicago and in a lot of the country, even in Texas. So with all that snow too, there's ways that you can help improve the habitat for animals that are around you. You could put out a bird feeder. You could try to create a pollinator garden that's going to create habitat for other animals. There's a lot of different things you can try to do to help habitats near you. For me or other people that might not have the space for a habitat right exactly where I live, I can always try to explore places where I could do habitat restoration, cleaning up the woods or the lake shore. There's a lot of fun things to do. And actually, there's a lot of stuff on the Field Museum website for the Action Center. If you're in the Chicago area and looking for stuff to do, I recommend checking it out. Another thing that's a problem with animals like pangolins is a lack of information. And so coming up is actually World Pangolin Day. It's in just 4 days on the 20th of February. It's official World Pangolin Day. They have a website. They have all sorts of fun ideas of things you can do to celebrate pangolins. So I recommend you check that out and tell your friends something cool that you learned today. Maybe do some research on your own and find some other cool pangolin discoveries. But spreading the information about these things is really cool and important so that we can all kind of spark that curiosity to get that information, because we do need more research to happen. So some of you might grow up and become really important pangolin researchers. There's still a lot of things we don't know. And I'm sure there might be some questions. Marcy, do you have some questions?
Yeah, first real quick, somebody is asking about a bat house. Is a bat house a good way to help our local animals?
That is a great way to help local animals. And no matter where you live that you're watching this, unless you live in Antarctica, you probably have bats near you. Bats are almost everywhere. So bat houses can be a great way to provide habitat for animals around you. And they eat insects. So that's fun.
That is great. Somebody asked the question of how big can they get? And we actually have one of our scientists, Rebecca, here with us today, and she can answer that question for us. And the answer is they can get really big, actually. They can be as little as 4 pounds and 45 inches, which is just a few feet, up to 72 pounds and 4.5 feet long. So I'm guessing that's a ground pangolin. They can get pretty darn big. And Rebecca also tells us that you can see some tree pangolins at the Brookfield Zoo if you are in the Chicago area and can get to the Brookfield Zoo, or maybe someday you can visit Chicago and come to the Field Museum and come to some of our zoos. You can see those pangolins there.
Yeah, and this is also just one scale from those giant ground pangolins. So this is a tiny piece of the biggest pangolin that we have here. That I have. There might be some more in the collection.
And Rebecca also says the size includes the tail and the body. So you saw in those tree pangolins that tail can be kind of long. So that helps their length. Another question is, are they cold-blooded or warm-blooded, Anna?
That's a great question. They are warm-blooded, which you'll see in the mammal group in general. We're going to be generating our own heat. That is a great question. Warm-blooded.
And our next question is, how do we get our pangolins, our specimens at the museum?
That's a great question. So today, we would be getting, if we get any new pangolins, they would be coming straight from the zoo. If any of the animals at the Brookfield Zoo were to die, then they would be able to be preserved for research here at the museum. This pangolin behind me, the skeleton, the number on there tells me that that is from the 1893 World's Fair. So that was on display 125 years ago. How did they get this pangolin? A great question that I don't know all the answers to. But in general, a lot of the older specimens in the museum were collected a long time ago. Sometimes people on museum expeditions were like hunting essentially to bring back animals for science and research that were not known here. Sometimes they were also purchasing animals from local communities that like have them because they're using those animals, just like we use animals in our environment. But yeah, it's a great question. But we're a big like research institution, so the pangolins that we do have are trying to learn more about so we can understand these animals.
That is great. And there's another question. This is a hard one. I'm not sure if our scientist Rebecca could help us with this or not, is how many scales can one pangolin have?
a great question.
Maybe while she's thinking about that, she does share with us that the Field Museum is part of a team of around 9 institutions from around the country that are helping pangolin conservation. That is really exciting to know. So when an animal unfortunately dies at a zoo, it can come to the museum, but we can learn from that animal while it's living and after it's passed away.
Yeah, that's so important.
And feel free to keep asking questions if you have any.
Yeah, and one thing I meant to talk more about, if nobody asked, is just COVID-19, because you may have heard pangolins come up with COVID-19. We're still learning a lot more about the origins of this virus, but we have seen related viruses in pangolins as well as bats. And so there's still a lot of work to try to understand with any zoonotic disease, like how and when it jumps from animals to people. But in general, you don't need to worry ever about like interacting with a pangolin or a bat and getting COVID-19 from it. One, you're not really going to interact with a pangolin, very likely. And the bats here are not connected to COVID-19. But in general, there's a lot of animals, or like a lot of diseases that have animal origins. If you think of some names you may have heard of: chickenpox, swine flu, bird flu. And as people continue to put animals in different higher stress situations and we are encroaching on their environment, we're seeing more and more of these transmission events. And also a lot of zoonotic transmission comes from domestic animals because there's big groups of them together and they interact more with people. So that might be like meat animals, so chickens, cows. So just things to think about with any zoonotic disease. And it's more important that we try to understand both these animals and their biology to realize our health is all connected than it is to ever it's never a good idea to blame wildlife, because the wildlife is part of a bigger system, the ecology that keeps the whole planet going. So understanding and protecting that big system is always really important. I saw a question of how many babies do they have, and I believe it's usually 1 or 2, although Rebecca can confirm that. But the other really cute thing is the baby pangolins will often ride on the mom by like the base of the tail here, and they look very cute. So if you're like, wow, I want to do more pangolin research, definitely look up stuff about baby pangolins. They're super cute.
And Rebecca has an answer for us for how many scales does a pangolin have. And I doubt any person has actually, if somebody has actually counted them, that's impressive. But she says that the Sunda pangolin, which is found in Southeast Asia, it has around 900 to 1,000 scales on it. Really amazing. And she confirms that all pangolins have between 1 and 2 babies at a time. And we have another question from Talcott School, Anna, and that question is, can pangolins live in Chicago?
That is a great question. So both yes and no. In the wild in Chicago, absolutely not. I don't know if you've seen the weather outside. We mentioned it before. It's very cold. It's very snowy. They would not do well in the winter. But they can survive in captivity. So Brookfield Zoo is one of the relatively few zoos that have pangolins in captivity. So they've figured out a way to make a very special diet that is similar to the ants and termites they would be eating in the wild, or uses those very same bugs. So they are in the zoo. You can see one at Brookfield when they reopen in March.
That is so cool. And can they survive in Colorado? Somebody asked. I think that's probably about the same about anywhere in the United States. Is that right, Anna?
I would think so. It's also just going to be a really different environment. It was actually really hard for zoos to figure out how to have pangolins in captivity at all. There's a book I read about David Attenborough, who you may be aware of as a naturalist. He's in a lot of British productions talking about wildlife. And he was helping get animals for a zoo in the UK. And they found a pangolin, and they were looking at it and watching it, but they just had to like let it wander away because they knew they couldn't figure out how to feed it sustainably because you need so many bugs, their favorite bug food. So now we figured it out, but for a long time, there were no pangolins in zoos, but there are some now.
And can you just remind us, Anna, where in the world they do live?
Yeah, so in the wild, the pangolin can live in parts of Asia and in Africa. So there's 8 species, 4 are found in Asia and 4 are found in Africa. They're in pretty warm environments. So not only is their food like specialized to where they live, so that might be a problem. Throughout a lot of the United States, they would not survive because we have very cold temperatures in parts of the year that would not be good for the pangolin.
That is
I saw
really great.
a question too about why do people want to eat pangolins? That's a very good question. So a lot of people believe that it has medicinal properties that can fix a lot of their problems. And especially if people have health problems, you really want to find a solution, like what's going to make me feel better, what's going to fix my blood pressure, or the pangolin scales are like listed as possible cures to a lot of things, but there's no research to back up that it fixes any of those problems. But unfortunately, the interest is still there.
That's great to know. We have 2 more questions and we're almost out of time. And let's see if you can help us with these. How long is a pangolin's neck?
Well, the skeleton, I think, can kind of help us see where their neck bones are because in just their kind of long shape, right? Our neck is part of our spine. It's connected to our whole back. You can see that like the space between their head and their shoulder blades is essentially what you might think of as a neck. It would have some flexibility. It's like not too long, but an okay length.
Nice. And I think we're about out of time, but thank you everybody for joining us here in our webinar. If you were also out on YouTube with us, we really appreciate you coming here. You can find more events like this on our website, and Jeff put that in the chat that you can see. And you can join us next week as well, where we are going to discuss how to draw a dinosaur. And so you can try to draw a dinosaur along with us. That will be next week on Tuesday at this time at 1 o'clock. Thank you, Anna, so much for joining us from the museum. And thank you, everybody, from joining us from your homes or maybe at your school.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great adventure out there. A happy Pangolin Day later this week. Stay curious, and I hope that you find more fun facts about pangolins.